The heavy, humid air of the southern night felt like a wet blanket against my skin, but it was nothing compared to the cold chill that settled in my bones when I saw her standing alone on that desolate stretch of highway. About 10 years ago, I was working a job that required me to traverse the winding backcountry roads of rural Georgia in the dead of night. I was a regional delivery driver, moving medical supplies between small-town clinics. It was a lonely existence, consisting of endless miles of asphalt, the hum of my truck's engine, and the flickering ghosts of trees illuminated by my high beams. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred the quiet of the night to the chaotic traffic of the city. But that specific Tuesday night changed my perspective on solitude forever. I was behind schedule due to a massive thunderstorm that had rolled through earlier in the evening. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick swirling fog that clung to the low-lying areas of the road. I was navigating a particularly narrow section of Highway 12, a road known locally for its sharp curves and lack of streetlights. My radio was buzzing with static, so I had turned it off, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the occasional thud of a moth hitting the windshield. As I rounded a sharp bend near an old abandoned sawmill, my headlights caught a flash of white. I instinctively tapped the brakes, slowing the heavy truck down. There, standing on the narrow grassy shoulder, was a woman. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing a simple white sundress that seemed almost to glow in the darkness. Her hair was dark and matted against her forehead, and she was clutching a small, worn leather satchel to her chest. My first instinct was caution. You hear stories about hitchhikers in the middle of nowhere and none of them end well. However, the sheer vulnerability of her appearance overrode my suspicion. She wasn't waving her arms or shouting, she just stood there, staring straight ahead with an expression of profound exhaustion. The temperature outside had dropped significantly after the rain, and she was shivering visibly. I pulled over about 20 yards ahead of her, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires. I looked in my side mirror and saw her slowly start walking toward the truck. Every step she took seemed heavy, as if she were dragging an invisible weight behind her. I rolled down the passenger window as she approached. When she reached the door, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of rain or the woods. It was a faint, sickly sweet scent, like lilies that had been left in a vase of stagnant water for too long. "Do you need a lift?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer immediately. She looked up at me, and her eyes were a startling pale blue, almost translucent. They seemed to reflect the dashboard lights in a way that felt unnatural. After a long silence, she simply nodded and climbed into the cab. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't ask. I just put the truck back into gear and pulled onto the road, the headlights cutting through the thickening fog. For the first few miles, the silence was absolute. I tried to make small talk, asking if she had been in an accident or if she lived nearby, but she remained motionless, staring out the side window into the blackness of the trees. The only sound in the cabin was the ticking of the heater and the occasional rustle of her dress. Then I noticed something in the rearview mirror that made my heart skip a beat. The interior light of the truck was dim, but it was enough to show the passenger seat clearly. As she sat there perfectly still, I realized that despite the dampness of the night and the wet grass she had been standing on, there were no wet footprints on my floor mats. Her dress, which should have been soaked from the recent storm, looked bone dry. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. I glanced over at her again, and this time she was looking at me. She wasn't blinking. Her pale blue eyes were fixed on my face with an intensity that felt predatory. Slowly, very slowly, she began to unbuckle her leather satchel. My breath caught in my throat as she reached inside, her movements fluid and silent. I wanted to hit the brakes and tell her to get out, but my legs felt like lead. I was no longer the driver of this journey. I was merely a witness to whatever was about to happen in the suffocating confines of that cab. Every movement she made was agonizingly slow, as if she were moving through water. My eyes flickered between the dark, fog-shrouded road ahead and the passenger seat next to me. I was terrified that if I took my eyes off her for too long, she would transform into something even more horrific. But if I didn't watch the road, I'd drive us both into a ravine. The sickly sweet smell of stagnant lilies grew stronger, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. It was the scent of a funeral home, and it was filling my lungs. She finally pulled her hand from the bag. I braced myself for a knife or a weapon, but instead she held a small silver locket. She stared at it with a vacant intensity, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the metal. Then, for the first time, she spoke. Her voice didn't sound like it came from her throat. It sounded like a recording played from a distance, hollow and devoid of any human resonance. "He's waiting at the bridge," she whispered. The hair on my arm stood straight up. There was only one major bridge on this stretch of Highway 12, the Blackwood Creek Bridge, and it was notorious. Decades ago, it had been the site of a tragic accident where a young woman had been run off the road by a hit-and-run driver. My mind began to scream at me to stop the truck, to kick her out, to run away into the night, but my body refused to obey. My foot stayed heavy on the accelerator, driving us deeper into the mist. I glanced at her again, and the sight nearly made me lose control of the wheel. The dim green light from the dashboard was reflecting off her skin, but there was no warmth to it. Her skin looked translucent, almost like wax. I could see the faint outline of her veins, but they weren't blue or red, they were a dull, bruised gray. Most terrifying of all, she still hadn't blinked, not once. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, watching for something I couldn't yet see. As we approached the descent toward the creek, the fog became an impenetrable wall of white. My high beams reflected off the mist, blinding me. I slowed the truck to a crawl, peering through the windshield. Suddenly, the woman sat bolt upright. Her pale hand shot out and gripped the dashboard, her fingernails digging into the plastic with a strength that didn't seem possible. "There," she said, her voice rising in pitch until it sounded like a screeching bird. "There he is." I slammed on the brakes as a figure appeared in the middle of the bridge. A man stood there, drenched in shadows, wearing a heavy dark coat. He wasn't moving. He was just standing in the center of my lane, staring directly into my headlights. My truck skidded on the damp pavement, the heavy tires groaning as we came to a halt just feet away from him. I looked over at the woman to ask if she knew him, but the passenger seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. The seatbelt was still buckled, but she was gone. Only the faint, lingering scent of lilies remained in the air. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped animal. I looked back at the man on the bridge and he began to walk toward the truck. He didn't walk like a normal person. He moved in jagged, jerky motions, his head tilted at an angle that suggested his neck was broken. With every step he took, the temperature in the cab dropped further until I could see my own breath frosting in the air. I realized then that the woman hadn't been looking for a ride, she had brought me here as an offering. The temperature in the cab plummeted until the air felt like shards of ice in my lungs. I sat frozen, my hands welded to the steering wheel as the man with the broken neck jerked closer. Every time he moved, I could hear a wet, grinding sound like bone rubbing against bone, even through the thick glass of the windshield. He stopped just inches from my bumper, his head lolloping to one side as he peered into the cab, searching for the passenger who was no longer there. In that moment of absolute terror, a primal instinct for survival overrode my paralysis. I realized that if he reached the door, I was a dead man. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I slammed the truck into reverse, the engine roaring in protest as I floored the accelerator. The truck fishtailed on the slick, foggy bridge, the tires screaming against the asphalt. I didn't care about the cargo or the vehicle. I only cared about putting distance between myself and that bridge. I backed up for nearly half a mile, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, terrified I would see the woman in white reappearing in the seat next to me. The scent of lilies was fading, replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of my own fear and the burning rubber of the tires. When I reached a wide enough shoulder, I performed a frantic three-point turn and sped back toward the main highway, pushing the truck far beyond its safe speed limits. I didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit 24-hour truck stop 30 miles away. I burst into the diner, shaking so violently that I couldn't even hold a cup of coffee. The waitress took one look at my face, pale as a ghost and drenched in cold sweat, and asked if I had seen the bridge specter. It turned out the story of the woman in the white dress and the man on the bridge was a dark legend in those parts. Local lore said they were a couple who had died 40 years ago. The man had been waiting for her to return from a trip, but she had been killed by a hit-and-run driver just yards from the bridge. Since then, they had been trying to find each other, occasionally using travelers as a bridge between their two worlds. The sheriff's deputy who arrived at the diner listened to my story with a grim, knowing expression. He told me I was lucky. Most people who pick up the lady in white aren't found until the fog clears. Their vehicles crashed into the creek or abandoned on the bridge with no sign of the driver. He escorted me back to the depot, but I knew I could never do that route again. The silence of the night, once my favorite part of the job, now felt like a predatory force waiting to swallow me whole. I quit the delivery job the very next morning. I moved to the desert where the air is bone dry and there isn't a bridge or a patch of fog for hundreds of miles. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to that sickly sweet smell of stagnant lilies. I check my rearview mirror every time I drive, half expecting to see a pair of translucent blue eyes staring back at me. I learned that night that some passengers never truly reach their destination, and some rides never actually end.